"Did you enjoy the gift I sent you, Mom?" my son asked, smiling as he set his phone down on the table. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him because the word gift didn't belong anywhere in my life these days. Not in the small kitchen where I counted every dollar. Not in the quiet routine I had built around getting by on less than I needed. So I looked up at him and said, "What gift?" And I watched his expression shift just slightly, confusion touching the edges of his confidence. And then I added, slower this time, "I never received anything." And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said before it, stretching across the table like something alive, something waiting to be understood. And that was the moment I realized that whatever he thought he had given me, whatever life he believed I was living, it wasn't the one I had been surviving for the past 2 years, because my reality had been very different, built on careful choices and quiet sacrifices. Mornings where I stood in front of my medicine cabinet deciding which prescription I could skip that week. Afternoons where I stretched a single grocery trip into meals that could last 5 days. Nights where I sat alone in my living room with the lights off just to keep the electric bill low, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself that my son was busy, that his success came with responsibilities. That distance didn't mean neglect. It just meant life had taken him somewhere I couldn't follow, and I had accepted that. I had made peace with that version of our relationship because it felt easier than asking questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. But now, sitting across from him at this table, watching the way his brow tightened, the way his eyes flickered toward his wife for just a second too long, I felt something shift inside me, something quiet but undeniable, because there was no misunderstanding in the way he said it, no hesitation in his voice. He believed he had sent me something significant, something impossible to miss. And that meant one of us was wrong. And I knew it wasn't me. I knew every envelope that had arrived in my mailbox, every bill I had opened, every empty space where something should have been. I knew the absence of help just as clearly as I knew the presence of struggle. And as that realization settled in, I became aware of her, standing just a few feet away, my daughter-in-law, her posture perfectly composed, her expression carefully neutral. But there was something in the way she held herself. Something in the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. Something that didn't match the calm she was trying to project, and I had seen that before, not in moments of joy or comfort, but in moments where something was being concealed, where the truth sat just beneath the surface waiting for the right question to pull it free. And suddenly, I found myself replaying the past in fragments. The missed phone calls, the conversations that felt rushed, the way certain topics were gently redirected, the way she always seemed to answer for him before he could speak. Small things at the time, easy to dismiss, easy to excuse, but now they began to line up in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like a pattern I had simply refused to see. And I sat there, hands folded in my lap, keeping my voice steady, keeping my expression calm, even as my thoughts began to sharpen, because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't understood before, that whatever had happened, whatever had been sent, it hadn't been lost by chance, it had been redirected. And the truth of it was sitting right here in this room with me, hidden behind polite smiles and careful silence. And I realized that I didn't need to raise my voice or demand answers. I didn't need to break the calm that had settled over the table, because the calm was already cracking on its own. All I had to do was pay attention. All I had to do was watch. And for the first time in a long while, I stopped thinking like someone waiting to be taken care of, and started seeing things exactly as they were. I did not say anything right away, and neither did he. But the quiet between us had changed. It was no longer comfortable or familiar. It felt like something fragile that could break if anyone moved too quickly. So I reached for my glass of water, just to give my hand something to do, just to steady myself. And I took a small sip as if that simple motion could buy me a moment to think, because my mind had already begun to pull at the edges of this new reality, testing it, turning it over, trying to understand how two completely different truths could exist at the same time. How my son could sit across from me believing he had taken care of me while I had spent the past 2 winters wearing the same worn coat, layering sweaters underneath just to keep warm, telling myself that the draft near the window was not so bad, that I could handle it, that I had handled worse before. And I realized then that I had become very good at making things smaller than they were, shrinking my own needs until they fit inside the space I believed I was allowed to occupy in his life. because it was easier that way, easier than admitting that something was missing, easier than asking why. But now the question had arrived on its own, and it was sitting right here at this table with us. Impossible to ignore, and I set the glass down carefully and looked at him again. Really looked at him this time. At the confidence that had always been there, the certainty that he was doing the right thing, and I saw it begin to waver, just slightly, like a reflection disturbed by a ripple, and he leaned forward a little, his voice softer now, more uncertain, as if he was trying to bridge a gap he had only just discovered. And he said that he had arranged everything 2 years ago, that there had been paperwork, that there were monthly payments meant to make my life easier, that he had wanted me to be comfortable. And as he spoke, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something clearer, because every word he said confirmed what I already knew, that none of it had reached me, not the paperwork, not the payments, not the comfort he thought he had provided. And I did not interrupt him. I let him finish. I let him lay out the version of reality he had been living in, because I needed to hear all of it. I needed to understand how complete the illusion had been, and when he stopped, when the words ran out and all that remained was that same heavy silence, I turned my gaze slightly, just enough to include her without making it obvious. And she was still there, still composed, still quiet, but there was a tension now that had not been there before, a subtle stiffness in the way she held her shoulders, the way her eyes did not quite meet mine. And it was a small thing, something easy to miss if you were not looking for it. But I was looking now, I was paying attention in a way I had not allowed myself to before, and the pieces began to settle into place, not all at once, not with any dramatic clarity, but slowly, quietly, like a puzzle that had been waiting for just one final piece to reveal the picture. And I thought about the time she had offered to help with paperwork, the time she had said she would handle things so I would not have to worry, the way she always seemed to be in the middle of every detail that connected him to me, and I felt that cold understanding deepen, because this was not about something being lost, it was about something being redirected, something being controlled, and I kept my voice calm when I finally spoke again, asking him if he had copies, if there was a way to see what had been sent, because I could feel the shift happening not just in me, but in him as well. The slow realization that something was wrong, that something did not add up. And for the first time since he had walked through my door that evening, he was no longer relaxed, no longer certain. And I knew then that whatever truth had been hidden between us was beginning to surface, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through quiet questions that could no longer be avoided. And I sat there, steady and composed, as everything we thought we understood about each other started to unravel. I watched him reach for his phone with a kind of urgency that had not been there before, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as if the answers were already waiting for him, neatly organized and ready to prove that everything he believed was true. And for a brief moment, I almost wished that would be the case, that he would turn the phone toward me with a reassuring smile and say there had been some simple mistake, something small and fixable, something that would allow us to return to the version of reality we had been living in just minutes ago. But as the seconds passed, I saw his expression change again, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable ways, the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his shoulders lost that easy confidence and became rigid. And I knew then that whatever he was seeing was not what he expected. And I sat there quietly, my hands still folded in my lap, giving him the space to process it, because this was no longer about convincing anyone of anything. The truth was beginning to reveal itself on its own, and it did not need my help. And he cleared his throat softly before speaking, reading pieces of information out loud, as if saying them might somehow make them align with what I had told him. Dates, amounts, confirmations, transfers that had been completed month after month, each one carefully recorded, each one directed to an account that I did not recognize, and I shook my head slowly, not interrupting, just letting that simple gesture answer for me, letting it stand in contrast to everything he was reading. And the more he spoke, the more the tension in the room seemed to grow, pressing in from all sides, until even the smallest movement felt significant. And that was when she shifted. Slightly, just enough to draw attention without meaning to, a subtle step back, a hand brushing against the edge of the counter as if she needed something to steady herself. And he noticed it too. I could see it in the way his voice faltered for just a moment before continuing. And when he finally stopped reading, when there was nothing left to say from the screen in his hand, he looked up, not at me, but at her. And the look on his face was no longer confusion. It was something deeper, something that carried the weight of realization. And I did not follow his gaze immediately. I kept my eyes on him for a second longer, watching the moment settle, because I understood that this was the point where everything shifted, not loudly, not with raised voices or accusations, but with a quiet understanding that could not be undone. And when I did turn my head, when I allowed myself to look at her fully, I saw that the composure she had been holding on to was beginning to crack, not in a dramatic way, not enough for anyone outside this room to notice, but enough for me, enough for someone who had spent years paying attention to the small things, the details that people often overlooked. And her eyes flickered toward the door for just a fraction of a second, as if considering escape, as if calculating her next move. And in that brief moment, everything became clear in a way that words could not have explained, because guilt does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears in the spaces between actions, in the hesitation before a response, in the way someone chooses not to meet your eyes. And I felt a strange calm settle over me as that clarity took hold. Not satisfaction, not relief, but something steadier, something grounded, because the uncertainty that had been building inside me was gone now, replaced by a simple, undeniable truth. And I realized that I did not need to confront her. I did not need to demand an explanation or force a confession, because the situation had already moved beyond that point. The evidence was there, the realization was there, and most importantly, he was beginning to see it for himself. And that mattered more than anything I could have said, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Sometimes the truth carries more weight when it is discovered rather than declared. And as I watched the two of them, the distance between them growing in ways that had nothing to do with physical space, I understood that whatever had been carefully constructed between us was now unraveling, thread by thread. And it would not be put back together the same way again. He did not raise his voice at first, and that was what made it feel more serious than anything else. Because instead of reacting, instead of filling the room with anger or accusations, he went quiet in a way I had not seen since he was a boy trying to understand something. That did not make sense to him, and he lowered his phone slowly, as if the weight of it had suddenly increased, and he looked at her again, this time without hesitation, without that automatic trust that had always been there before. And he asked her a simple question, one that should have had a simple answer, but the way it hung in the air made it clear that nothing about this was simple anymore. And she smiled, a small, practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she said there must be some kind of mistake, that perhaps the bank had processed something incorrectly, that paperwork sometimes got lost, that things happened. And under normal circumstances those explanations might have been enough. They might have smoothed things over, but not now, not after everything that had just been revealed, because her words sounded too prepared, too carefully arranged, like something she had said before in a different context. And I watched him listen to her, really listen, and I saw the moment when he began to separate what he wanted to believe from what was actually in front of him. And it was not a dramatic shift, it was quiet, internal, the kind of change that happens behind the eyes. And he asked another question, more specific this time, about the account information, about who had handled the transfers, about the details that should have been routine but were now suddenly important. And she hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for the silence to notice. And then she answered. But the answer did not land the way she intended. It did not restore confidence. It did not close the gap that had opened between them. It only made it wider. And I sat there, still, composed, letting them speak, because this was no longer something I needed to lead. The truth had taken on a life of its own, and it was moving through the room with a kind of quiet certainty. And as they continued, I found myself drifting briefly into memory, not to escape the moment, but to understand it, to trace back the path that had led us here. And I remembered the first time she offered to help manage something for me, how grateful I had been, how relieved, because it felt like support, like care. And I remembered the times she reassured me that everything was taken care of, that I did not need to worry, that she and my son had it handled. And I had believed her, not because I was naive, but because trust had always been the foundation of our family, and I had no reason to question it. Until now, and I realized that what I had thought was kindness might have been something else entirely, something more controlled, more deliberate. And that realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of clarity that felt almost cold, because once you see something for what it is, you cannot return to the way you saw it before. And I brought my attention back to the present, to the way his questions were becoming more direct, less tentative, to the way her responses were becoming shorter, more careful, and I could see the distance growing between them, not physically, but in the way they were no longer aligned, no longer moving in the same direction. And there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where she stopped trying to explain and simply looked at him, as if weighing whether to continue or to shift tactics entirely. And that was when I understood that whatever had been hidden was no longer fully under her control, that the narrative she had maintained was beginning to break apart under the weight of its own inconsistencies. And I remained exactly where I was, not intervening, not offering comfort or judgment, because this was not my moment to resolve. It was theirs to face. And as the quiet stretched again, heavier now, but more honest, I felt something settle within me, a sense that the uncertainty that had once defined my days was finally being replaced by something solid, something real, even if it was not what I had hoped for, because truth, even when it is difficult, has a way of grounding you, of giving you something steady to stand on, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that steadiness return. He did not argue with her immediately, and that hesitation said more than any raised voice could have, because for the first time since they had walked into my home, he was no longer standing beside her. He was standing across from her, and the difference between those two positions was quiet but profound. And I watched as he straightened slightly, as if something inside him had settled into place, and he asked her again, this time with a firmness that left less room for explanation, how the account information had been changed, who had authorized it, why the confirmations were all directed to an email that was not mine, and she blinked, just once, but it was enough for him to see what I had already begun to understand. And she tried again, adjusting her tone, softening it, suggesting that perhaps she had handled some of the details to make things easier, that maybe there had been a misunderstanding about which account was best, that she had only been trying to help. And there it was, that word again, help, the same word I had accepted so easily before, the same word that had allowed all of this to happen without question. And I felt a quiet shift inside me as I listened, not anger, not bitterness, but a kind of recognition, because the pattern was clear now. It had always been framed as convenience, as care, as something done for my benefit, and I had allowed it because it felt easier than insisting on control, easier than navigating systems and documents and accounts that seemed increasingly complicated with each passing year. And as that realization settled, I became aware of how carefully this had been done, not in large, obvious actions, but in small, consistent choices, decisions made just out of sight, adjustments that seemed reasonable in isolation but together formed something else entirely. And he was seeing it now too. I could tell by the way he stepped back slightly, creating a space between them that had not been there before. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was no longer searching, it was certain, and he said that the account listed in the records was not mine, that the email associated with the confirmations was not mine. And he asked her directly why that was. And this time she did not answer right away. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if trying to decide which version of the truth would serve her best. And that pause stretched just long enough for everything to become unmistakable. And when she finally spoke, her explanation was simpler, less detailed, as if the complexity of the earlier answers had become too difficult to maintain. And she said that she had meant to tell him that things had been handled differently than planned, that she had intended to fix it before it became an issue. And I felt something settle into place as I heard that, because it was not a denial, it was not confusion, it was an acknowledgement, quiet but clear, that something had been done intentionally. And he exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible but heavy with understanding. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had been revealed filling the room in a way that made everything else feel distant. And I remained where I was, still and composed, not stepping in, not offering words that would only disrupt what was unfolding naturally, Because this was no longer about uncovering the truth. That part was already happening. This was about what came next, about how they would face it. And I realized that my role in this moment was not to push or to guide, but simply to witness, to hold steady in the presence of something that had been hidden for too long. And as I watched them, the space between them growing more defined with each passing second, I understood that whatever had been taken from me was no longer the center of this moment. What mattered now was the clarity that had replaced the uncertainty, the way everything that once felt confusing had aligned into something undeniable. And I felt no need to speak, no need to demand restitution or explanation, because the truth itself had already begun to do the work, and it was more powerful than anything I could have said. He did not sit back down right away, and that told me everything I needed to know about what was happening inside him, because this was no longer just confusion or doubt. This was the moment when everything he had trusted began to separate into what was real and what only seemed real, and I watched as he took a slow breath, his hand still holding the phone at his side, not looking at it anymore, not needing to, because the answers were no longer on the screen, they were standing right in front of him. And he asked her one more time, but this time there was no softness left in his voice. No space for interpretation, just a direct question that did not leave room for anything but the truth. And she hesitated again, longer now, long enough that the silence itself became an answer, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the shifting of possibilities, the search for a version of events that could still hold together under pressure. But the structure she had built was already weakening. And when she finally spoke, the tone was different, less certain, less controlled, and she said that she had only meant to manage things temporarily, that she had planned to transfer everything properly later, that there had been timing issues, paperwork delays, things that sounded reasonable when said quickly but did not stand up to the weight of what we all now understood, and he listened without interrupting. But he was no longer absorbing her words the way he had before. He was measuring them, weighing them against what he had just discovered, and I could see the moment when something inside him settled into a new understanding, something that could not be undone, and he asked her if any of the funds had ever reached me, just once, even partially, and she did not answer. She only looked away for a brief second, and that was enough. Enough for the truth to complete itself without needing to be spoken out loud. And the room felt different then, not tense in the same way as before, but clearer, as if the fog that had been surrounding us had finally lifted, leaving everything exposed exactly as it was. And I remained still, not moving, not reacting outwardly, because inside I had already moved past the need for answers, the need for explanations. What I had needed was clarity, and now I had it. And with that clarity came something else, something quieter but stronger, a sense of control that I had not felt in a long time, not over them, not over what had happened, but over myself, over how I would respond to this moment. And I chose to remain exactly as I was, composed, observant, present, and he stepped back another inch, creating even more distance between them, and he said her name in a way that carried both disbelief and understanding, as if he was acknowledging not just what she had done, but who she had revealed herself to be. And she tried once more, softer now, almost pleading, saying that she had intended to fix everything, that she had not meant for it to go this far, that things had gotten complicated, and I listened to those words without reacting, because intent no longer mattered in the presence of outcome, and the outcome was clear: the years of absence, the missing support, the life I had adjusted around a reality that had been quietly altered without my knowledge, and I felt no anger rise within me. Only a steady recognition of what had been, and what would not continue. And he finally looked at me again, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time in this new context, not just as his mother, but as someone who had been living a completely different life than the one he had imagined. And there was something in his expression that had not been there before, something heavier, something that carried the weight of responsibility and realization. And I met his gaze calmly, not accusing, not demanding, just present, allowing him to understand without needing to be told. And in that exchange, I saw the shift complete itself, the moment where he stepped fully into the truth of the situation, and I knew that whatever came next would not be built on assumptions or illusions, but on what had been revealed here, in this quiet room, through simple questions and undeniable answers, and as I sat there, feeling the stillness settle around me, I understood that while something had been taken from me over the past 2 years, something else had been returned in this moment, something far more valuable than money or property, something that could not be redirected or controlled by anyone else. And that was the clarity to see everything exactly as it was, without confusion, without doubt, and without fear. He did not speak for a long moment after that, and in that silence I could almost hear the shift happening inside him, the quiet rearranging of everything he thought he knew. Because there are moments in life when understanding does not arrive gradually. It arrives all at once, and it changes the way you see everything that came before it. And I watched him take that in, not as a son trying to defend what was familiar, but as a man confronting something he could no longer ignore. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but different, grounded in a way that told me he had crossed some invisible line within himself. And he said that he wanted to see everything, not just the summaries on his phone, but the full records, the transfers, the account details, every piece of documentation connected to what had been done. And there was no hesitation in the way he said it, no softness left to soften the request, and she reacted immediately, not with anger, not with denial, but with something quieter, something more revealing, a reluctance that showed itself in small ways, in the way she shifted her weight, in the way her eyes moved toward the hallway, as if considering leaving the room. And she said that it was not necessary to go that far, that things could be resolved without digging into every detail, that they could fix it moving forward. And I recognized that instinct, not from her, but from the situation itself. Because when the truth begins to surface, there is often an attempt to contain it, to limit how much is seen, how much is understood. But he did not accept that. He shook his head slowly, and he said that it was necessary, that he needed to know exactly what had happened, not just for now, but for everything that had already passed. And as he spoke, I felt something settle more firmly inside me, because this was no longer just about discovery. It was about accountability, about the willingness to face what had been done without turning away. And she looked at him, then with an expression that was harder to read, not composed anymore, not carefully neutral, but searching, as if she was trying to find a version of him that would still respond the way he used to, the way that would allow her to guide the outcome. But that version was no longer there, and I could see that realization land in the subtle tightening of her posture, in the way her shoulders lifted slightly before dropping again, and she nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that the situation had moved beyond her control, and she said she would gather the information, that she would show him everything. But even in that agreement, there was a hesitation, a delay that suggested she was already thinking ahead, already considering what those details would reveal. And I remained where I was, quiet, observant, because I understood that what mattered most had already been uncovered. The rest was confirmation, documentation of something we already knew to be true. And as they stood there, the space between them no longer uncertain but clearly defined, I found myself reflecting not on what had been taken, but on how easily it had happened, not through force or confrontation, but through trust, through the gradual shifting of responsibility from one set of hands to another. And I realized that this was not just a moment of loss. It was a moment of understanding, of seeing how small decisions, repeated over time, can lead to something much larger than anyone intended to acknowledge. And I did not feel regret in the way I might have expected. I felt clarity, because regret belongs to a version of the past that cannot be changed, but clarity belongs to the present, and it shapes what comes next. And he turned back toward me then, his expression softer now, but still serious. And he said that he was sorry, not in a dramatic way, not with long explanations, but simply, directly, as if the weight of that word was enough on its own. And I nodded, not dismissing it, not expanding on it, just acknowledging it for what it was, because apologies do not undo what has happened, but they can mark the beginning of something different. And as the room settled into a quieter stillness, one that felt less heavy and more grounded, I understood that we had reached a point where nothing more needed to be said in that moment, because everything that mattered had already been understood, and what remained was not confusion or doubt, but the steady presence of truth and the quiet decisions that would follow it. She did not leave the room right away after agreeing to show him everything, and that hesitation carried its own meaning. Because when someone knows that the next step will reveal more than they can control, time suddenly becomes something to hold on to, something to stretch just a little longer, and I watched as she moved slowly, deliberately, as if each second gave her space to think, to prepare, to gather whatever composure she still had left. And he did not rush her, he did not push, but he also did not step back from what he had asked, and that quiet persistence told me more than anything else could have, because it meant he was no longer willing to accept partial answers, no longer willing to live inside a version of reality that depended on trust alone. And as she walked toward the hallway, her steps measured and controlled, I felt a shift in the room, a kind of stillness that settles when something irreversible has already happened, not in action, but in understanding. And I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap, not following her with my eyes, not needing to, because what she would bring back would not change what I already knew. It would only confirm it in ways that could no longer be softened or explained away. And he stayed where he was for a moment longer before finally sitting down again. But the way he sat was different, not relaxed, not at ease, but upright, focused, as if he was preparing himself for what was coming next, and I could see the distance in his expression, not directed at me, but at the situation itself, as if he was mentally stepping outside of it just enough to see it clearly. And after a few moments he spoke, quietly, almost to himself, saying that he should have checked sooner, that he should have made sure things were actually reaching me. And I listened without interrupting, because I understood that this was not about blame, not in the way people often think of it. It was about realization, about the recognition of something that had gone unnoticed for too long. And I did not need to reassure him or dismiss what he was feeling, because those things would come later, in their own time. And when she returned, she was holding a folder, simple, unremarkable, but the way she held it made it feel heavier than it should have been, as if the contents carried more than just numbers and records. And she placed it on the table between us, not directly in front of him, not directly in front of me, but in that shared space where it could not belong to either of us alone. And for a moment no one reached for it, no one moved, as if we all understood that opening. It would make everything final, everything undeniable. And then he leaned forward, slowly, and opened it, his movements careful, controlled. And as he began to look through the documents, I watched his expression, not the pages, because the pages would say what they needed to say, but his reaction would reveal what mattered most. And I saw it unfold in stages, the initial focus, the attempt to understand, followed by the tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift in his breathing, the way his shoulders became more rigid with each page he turned. And he did not speak immediately. He did not react outwardly, but the silence itself became heavier, more defined, until it was clear that whatever was written there was not open to interpretation. And when he finally looked up, his eyes did not go to her first, they came to me. And there was something in that look that had not been there before, not just regret, not just understanding, but a kind of clarity that mirrored my own. And I met his gaze steadily, without judgment, without expectation, because we were both standing in the same truth now, seeing it from different places, but recognizing it for what it was. And then he turned to her, holding one of the pages in his hand, and asked a question that did not need many words, a question that pointed directly to what the records showed. And she did not interrupt. She did not try to redirect. She simply stood there, listening, and when she answered, her voice was quieter than before, stripped of the confidence it once carried. And in that moment it became clear that whatever control she had once held over this situation was gone, replaced by something far less certain, something that could not reshape what had already been revealed. And I sat there, still and composed, not needing to move, not needing to speak, because everything that needed to be seen had already come into view. And what remained was not the discovery of truth, but the acceptance of it, and the quiet understanding that nothing would return to the way it had been before. He did not say anything after her last answer, and that silence felt different from all the others that had filled the room before, because this one was not uncertain or heavy with questions. It was settled, grounded in something final. And I watched as he slowly placed the paper back into the folder, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he was closing not just a document, but a chapter of understanding that could not be reopened in the same way again. And for a moment he simply sat there, his gaze resting on the table, not avoiding anything, just absorbing what had already been made clear. And I could see that whatever he had believed before had fully shifted now, replaced by something quieter but far more solid. And when he finally looked up, there was no confusion left in his eyes, no attempt to reconcile two different versions of reality, only a calm recognition of what was true. And he did not ask her anything else, not because there was nothing more to ask, but because the answers no longer needed to be spoken. They were already there, in the records, in the pauses, in the way everything had unfolded without resistance once it began to surface. And she stood where she was, still, composed in appearance but no longer in control of the situation, her presence no longer shaping the narrative, but simply existing within it. And I realized then that the moment we were in was not about confrontation or resolution in the way people often expect. It was about clarity, about the quiet acceptance of something that could not be undone or reinterpreted. And I felt that clarity settle fully within me, not as a sharp emotion, not as anger or even relief, but as something steady and undeniable, something that allowed me to sit there without needing to react, without needing to claim anything or defend anything, because the truth had already done that work on its own. And I shifted slightly in my chair, not out of discomfort, but simply to acknowledge the passing of the moment. And I looked at both of them, really looked, not as roles within a family, but as people standing in the consequences of their own choices. And I understood that what came next would not be decided in this room, not in this silence, but in the actions that would follow once we all left it. And that thought did not bring uncertainty. It brought a quiet sense of direction, because for the first time in a long while I was not waiting for anything to be given to me, not support, not explanation, not even an apology. I already had what I needed. I had seen the truth clearly, without confusion or doubt, and that was enough to move forward on my own terms. And I stood up slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple movement that marked the end of something, and neither of them stopped me. Neither of them tried to fill the space with words that would only delay what had already been understood. And as I walked toward the doorway, I did not feel like I was leaving anything behind, not in the way I might have once feared, because what had been taken from me had already been gone for some time. What I carried with me now was something different, something that could not be redirected or hidden or controlled by anyone else. And as I reached the threshold, I paused for just a moment, not to look back, but to let the stillness settle one final time. And in that quiet, I understood something with absolute certainty. They had believed I had nothing, but they had been wrong, because what I had now was clarity, and that was something no one could take away.